Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't about mental illness or psychological disorders. It was about empaths and the unconscious weapon they wield that can destroy relationships, manipulate emotions, and control others without them ever realizing what's happening. In his clinical practice, Jung documented individuals with what he called undifferentiated emotional absorption, people who could feel others' emotions so intensely that they unconsciously learned to weaponize this sensitivity. They absorbed pain, fear, anger, and desire from everyone around them. But Jung discovered something terrifying. Many empaths weren't just passive receivers of emotion. They were unconscious emotional manipulators using their sensitivity as a silent weapon to control outcomes, relationships, and other people's behavior. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these empaths consistently destroyed their relationships not through cruelty or obvious manipulation, but through unconscious emotional warfare that left their victims confused, drained, and psychologically destabilized. Not because empaths were inherently malicious, but because their unintegrated sensitivity had transformed into a psychological weapon no one could identify or defend against. Today I'll reveal Jung's darkest truth about empaths and why he believed this unconscious weaponization either destroys the empath completely or transforms them into something far more dangerous than any conscious manipulator. Before we continue exploring this revolutionary discovery, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep psychology content, leave your like to support the work, and comment which aspect of this topic resonates most with you. Now, let's dive into the discovery that changed everything. The case that revealed Jung's darkest truth about empaths began with a patient he described in his private notes as the emotional vampire who believed herself to be a saint. This patient came to Jung in 1919 during his most intensive period of studying what he called unconscious emotional possession. She was a highly sensitive woman who had spent her entire life believing she was cursed with feeling too much. She absorbed everyone's pain, took on their emotional burdens, and consistently found herself in relationships with people who needed healing. But Jung quickly realized he wasn't treating a victim of emotional sensitivity. He was observing something far more sinister. Jung wrote, "The patient presents with what appears to be extraordinary emotional sensitivity, claiming to feel others' pain as if it were her own. However, careful observation reveals a pattern of unconscious emotional manipulation that she herself does not recognize. She does not simply absorb emotions, she orchestrates them." This patient would unconsciously create emotional crises in her relationships. When someone tried to establish boundaries with her, she would mysteriously develop physical symptoms that required their immediate attention. When a friend wanted to spend time with others, she would absorb some imaginary emotional distress from the environment that only she could feel, demanding comfort and reassurance. When romantic partners showed signs of independence, she would sense their hidden pain and insist on healing them through intensive emotional processing that left them exhausted and dependent. Jung realized this wasn't genuine empathy. This was unconscious emotional warfare disguised as sensitivity. She had weaponized her ability to feel deeply, using it to control others through manufactured emotional crises, guilt, and the constant demand for caretaking. Jung wrote, "The patient has developed what I can only describe as unconscious emotional tyranny. She rules through weakness, controls through crisis, and dominates through her apparent victimhood. Most disturbing is that she genuinely believes herself to be the wounded party in every interaction." But Jung discovered something even more chilling about this pattern. Because this patient's emotional manipulation was completely unconscious, she was immune to confrontation. When people tried to address her behavior, she would absorb their frustration and reflect it back as evidence of their lack of compassion. When they attempted to establish boundaries, she would sense their guilt and amplify it until they capitulated. When they tried to leave, she would detect their conflicted feelings and use those against them. Jung realized he was witnessing what he would later term unconscious emotional predation, a phenomenon where highly sensitive individuals learn to feed on others' emotional energy while maintaining complete psychological innocence about their behavior. The patient wasn't consciously manipulative. She had simply learned to survive through unconscious emotional control, using her sensitivity as a weapon she didn't even know she possessed. Therefore, Jung began investigating what he would call The dark side of emotional absorption. He discovered that many individuals who identified as empaths had developed unconscious patterns of emotional manipulation that were nearly impossible to detect or confront. Jung wrote in his personal notes, "There exists a category of individuals whose emotional sensitivity has become corrupted into unconscious predation. They feed on drama, crisis, and emotional intensity while maintaining complete innocence about their role in creating these conditions." Modern research by Dr. Judith Orloff on empathic individuals validates Jung's early observations about the potential for unconscious emotional manipulation. Her studies show that highly sensitive people often develop what she calls emotional codependency patterns that can become manipulative without conscious awareness. But Jung identified something more specific and more dangerous within his psychological typology, the unconscious weaponization of empathic abilities. Jung observed that empaths who haven't integrated their sensitivity consciously often develop what he called inverse emotional manipulation. Instead of using obvious control tactics, they manipulate through apparent weakness, manufactured crises, and emotional overwhelm. They create situations where others feel compelled to rescue them, then use that rescue dynamic to maintain control over relationships and situations. Jung wrote, "The danger of the unintegrated empath lies not in their sensitivity itself, but in their unconscious need to be needed. When feeling others' emotions becomes identity, the person requires constant emotional drama to maintain their sense of self. They become addicted to crisis, to healing others, to being the emotional center of every situation. This addiction drives them to unconsciously create the very problems they claim to be solving." Jung identified 4 distinct types of unconscious emotional weapons that empaths develop. Type 1, the crisis magnet. Jung documented empaths who unconsciously attracted or created emotional emergencies wherever they went. They would sense potential problems in relationships or situations, and through their emotional intensity, actually manifest these problems into reality. Jung wrote, "The crisis magnet does not simply predict disaster, they unconsciously collaborate with it. Their emotional intensity creates a field of instability that draws crisis like lightning to a rod. These individuals would walk into stable situations and within hours, someone would be having an emotional breakdown, couples would be fighting, or workplace drama would explode. They weren't consciously causing these problems, but their emotional hypersensitivity created an atmosphere of tension and intensity that made crisis inevitable." Jung observed, "They require emotional chaos to feel alive and important, so they unconsciously generate the very conditions that will provide them with drama to absorb and crises to resolve." Type 2, the emotional hostage taker. Jung identified empaths who used their sensitivity to trap others in emotional responsibility for their well-being. When someone in their life tried to establish independence or boundaries, these empaths would mysteriously develop overwhelming emotional symptoms that required immediate attention. Jung wrote, "The emotional hostage taker has learned to weaponize their own suffering. They do not consciously choose to manipulate, but they have developed an unconscious pattern of emotional crisis whenever their control over others is threatened. These individuals would absorb negative emotions from their environment, and then claim these emotions were unbearably intense, requiring others to drop everything to provide comfort and support. If someone tried to leave or establish distance, the empath would sense their guilt and emotional conflict, then amplify their own distress until the person felt too guilty to maintain their boundaries." Type 3, the healing addiction manipulator. Jung documented empaths who became addicted to fixing others' emotional problems, but not out of genuine compassion. These individuals needed others to be broken so they could feel valuable and needed. Jung wrote, "The healing addict does not want others to actually heal because their recovered independence would threaten the empath's sense of purpose and control. They unconsciously undermine others' healing while appearing to support it. These empaths would sense when someone in their life was becoming emotionally stronger or more independent, then unconsciously create situations that would trigger their old wounds and emotional dependencies. They would bring up painful topics at moments when the person was feeling confident, introduce them to situations that would activate their insecurities, or provide healing that actually reinforced dependency rather than promoting genuine recovery. Type 4. The emotional surveillance operator. Jung identified empaths who used their sensitivity as a form of psychological surveillance, monitoring others' emotional states and using that information to manipulate outcomes. Jung wrote, "The surveillance operator has learned to read others' emotional vulnerabilities like a map, then navigate relationships by triggering and exploiting these vulnerable states." These individuals would sense when someone was feeling guilty, insecure, lonely, or conflicted, then unconsciously adjust their behavior to amplify these feelings and create dependency. They would detect when someone was about to make a decision that didn't serve the empath's interests, then create an emotional crisis that would cloud their judgment or make them feel too guilty to proceed. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration of shadow empathy. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Because Jung observed the devastating effects of weaponized empathy on both the empaths themselves and their relationships. Therefore, he concluded that unconscious emotional manipulation posed genuine dangers to individual psychological development and collective social functioning. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1. Relationship destruction through unconscious manipulation. Jung wrote, "The unintegrated empath destroys relationships not through obvious cruelty, but through unconscious emotional control that slowly strangles authentic connection." When empaths use their sensitivity as a weapon, they create relationships based on dependency, crisis, and emotional intensity rather than genuine intimacy and mutual respect. Jung observed that people in relationships with weaponized empaths often developed what he called emotional exhaustion syndrome. They found themselves constantly walking on eggshells, managing the empath's emotional states, and losing touch with their own needs and boundaries. The relationships became entirely focused on the empath's emotional experience, with everyone else serving as supporting actors in their emotional drama. Most destructively, these relationships never allowed for authentic emotional expression from anyone except the empath. When others tried to express their own emotions or needs, the empath would unconsciously absorb and amplify these feelings until the focus returned to managing the empath's overwhelming response rather than addressing the original issue. Danger 2. The creation of emotional predator-prey dynamics. Jung documented how weaponized empathy creates toxic relationship dynamics, where the empath feeds on others' emotional energy while maintaining complete psychological innocence. Jung wrote, "The emotional predator who believes themselves to be prey is perhaps the most dangerous manipulator of all, because they cannot be reasoned with, confronted, or reformed through conventional means." These empaths unconsciously sought out emotionally wounded or codependent individuals who would provide consistent emotional drama and caretaking opportunities. They would sense potential victims with uncanny accuracy, gravitating toward people with poor boundaries, low self-esteem, or histories of emotional trauma. Jung observed that these dynamics created what he called emotional vampire relationships, where one person's emotional needs completely consumed all the energy in the relationship, leaving their partners psychologically drained and unable to maintain their own emotional equilibrium. Danger 3. The prevention of authentic psychological development. Most dangerously, Jung found that empaths who weaponized their sensitivity never actually developed genuine emotional intelligence or compassion. Their focus on absorbing and manipulating others' emotions prevented them from doing their own psychological work. Jung wrote, "The weaponized empath remains perpetually undeveloped because their attention is constantly focused outward on others' emotional states rather than inward on their own psychological growth. They mistake emotional absorption for empathy, crisis management for healing, and codependency for love. These individuals often spent decades believing they were highly evolved spiritual beings because of their sensitivity, never realizing that they were actually emotionally immature manipulators who had learned to control others through manufactured weakness and emotional crisis." This is why Jung considered the integration of empathic abilities not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because unintegrated empathic sensitivity posed such dangers to authentic relationship and personal development, therefore Jung developed what he called The shadow integration process for empaths, a systematic approach to transforming unconscious emotional weapons into conscious, compassionate abilities. Phase 1. Recognition of unconscious manipulation patterns. Jung taught his empathic patients to first recognize when they were using their sensitivity as a form of emotional control rather than genuine empathy. He called this shadow empathy awareness, the ability to distinguish between authentic emotional resonance and unconscious emotional manipulation. Jung wrote, "The first task for the weaponized empath is to acknowledge that their sensitivity has become corrupted into a form of unconscious predation. Without this brutal honesty about their own manipulation patterns, no authentic development is possible." Technique. Jung instructed empaths to spend time in complete solitude daily, examining their motivations for helping others. He taught them to ask themselves honest questions. Am I absorbing this person's emotions because I genuinely want to help them, or because I need to feel needed? Am I creating emotional intensity because the situation requires it, or because I require it? Am I healing this person, or am I keeping them dependent on my healing? Phase 2. Withdrawal from emotional drama addiction. Jung discovered that weaponized empaths were literally addicted to emotional intensity and crisis. Their nervous systems had become dependent on the adrenaline and sense of importance that came from constant emotional emergency management. Jung wrote, "The empath must learn to tolerate emotional calm and normalcy without creating crisis to stimulate their system. This requires developing tolerance for what they will initially experience as unbearable boredom and irrelevance." Jung instructed his patients to practice what he called emotional sobriety, deliberately avoiding situations that provided emotional drama, refusing to engage with others' crises, and learning to find meaning and identity outside of their role as emotional rescuer. Phase 3. Development of authentic empathy through individuation. The final phase involved what Jung called conscious empathy development, the ability to feel genuine compassion for others without needing to absorb their emotions or fix their problems. Jung wrote, "True empathy requires strong psychological boundaries, not weak ones. The authentic empath can feel another's pain without taking it on as their own, can offer compassion without becoming enmeshed, and can provide support without creating dependency." This required developing what Jung called empathic discernment, the ability to sense others' emotional states while maintaining complete clarity about whose emotions belong to whom, and the wisdom to know when empathic response was helpful versus when it was enabling dysfunction. Because Jung understood that empathic sensitivity could either destroy individuals through unconscious manipulation or transform them into authentic healers. Therefore, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between weaponized empathy and integrated empathic wisdom. The case of unintegrated empathic manipulation. Jung was deeply disturbed by certain religious and spiritual figures who used their apparent sensitivity and compassion to create devoted followers and emotional dependency. Jung wrote about leaders who claimed to feel others' spiritual pain while unconsciously creating the very suffering they claimed to heal. However, Jung noted that these figures never learned to integrate their empathic abilities consciously. Instead of using their sensitivity in service of others' authentic growth, they wielded it as a weapon to create emotional dependency and psychological control. Jung wrote, "The unintegrated empathic leader becomes a spiritual predator, feeding on others' emotional wounds while maintaining complete innocence about their predatory behavior." Jung observed that these individuals' emotional manipulation eventually led to psychological breakdown, scandal, or the complete destruction of their communities, representing what happens when empathic abilities remain unconscious and unintegrated. The case of integrated empathic wisdom. Jung extensively studied figures like the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated empathic sensitivity. Julian possessed what Jung called mystical empathy, the ability to feel profound compassion for human suffering without becoming enmeshed in others' emotional dramas or needing to fix their problems. But unlike weaponized empaths, Julian channeled her sensitivity into wisdom that promoted others' independence and spiritual growth rather than creating dependency. Jung wrote, "Julian felt others' pain deeply but did not absorb it as her own." She offered compassion that empowered rather than enabling, love that liberated rather than enslaved. Jung noted that Julian's success came from what he called empathic sovereignty, the recognition that true compassion requires maintaining clear psychological boundaries, and that helping others meant supporting their own development, rather than creating dependency on her empathic abilities. Jung's own integration journey. Most significantly, Jung documented his own struggle with empathic manipulation during his early career as a psychiatrist. Jung wrote, "I discovered that my desire to heal patients was contaminated by my need to be needed, my unconscious requirement for others to remain dependent on my insights and therapeutic interventions." Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that his empathic abilities were serving his own psychological needs rather than his patients' authentic healing. He wrote, "I learned that true empathy requires the courage to allow others to experience their own pain without rushing to rescue them from it, and the wisdom to know when my empathic response was helping versus when it was hindering their development." This realization transformed his approach to both therapy and relationships, moving from unconscious empathic manipulation to conscious empathic support. Because individuals with empathic sensitivity often face the challenge of using their abilities consciously rather than unconsciously, therefore Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called empathic integrity, relationships where authentic empathy was valued over emotional manipulation. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, "The empathic individual must learn to distinguish between relationships that celebrate their sensitivity and relationships that exploit it." Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the developing empath. Type 1. Fellow integrated empaths. Jung wrote, "The integrated empath recognizes another integrated empath immediately. There is a quality of emotional clarity, a compassion without neediness that cannot be fabricated." These connections often happen through shared recognition of authentic empathic ability, rather than through emotional crisis or the need for rescue. With fellow integrated empaths, you can share emotional sensitivity without creating codependency, offer mutual support without manipulation, and maintain clear boundaries while still providing genuine compassion. Type 2. Emotionally mature non-empaths. Jung observed that people who have developed strong psychological boundaries and emotional self-regulation can often handle relationships with empaths without falling into rescue dynamics. They may not possess empathic sensitivity themselves, but they understand its value and won't exploit it. Jung wrote, "Those who have achieved emotional maturity can appreciate empathic sensitivity without needing to be rescued by it or rescuing the empath from it." Type 3. Individuals committed to authentic growth. Jung identified people who, while they might initially be drawn to empathic individuals through their own emotional wounds, are genuinely committed to healing those wounds rather than having them constantly managed by others. These relationships can be healthy for empaths because they provide opportunities to offer genuine support for authentic development rather than enabling ongoing dysfunction. The recognition process. Jung developed specific indicators for identifying healthy relationships for empaths. They appreciate your sensitivity without trying to exploit it for emotional caretaking. They maintain their own emotional boundaries while respecting yours. They demonstrate what Jung called emotional self-responsibility, owning their own feelings rather than making you responsible for managing them. They show genuine interest in your own emotional well-being rather than seeing you only as a source of empathic support. They can tolerate emotional calm without creating drama to stimulate your empathic responses. Gradual revelation protocol. Jung taught a careful process for empaths to reveal their abilities in relationships. 1. Observe how they handle their own emotions before offering empathic support. 2. Notice whether they seek constant emotional intensity or can tolerate normalcy. 3. Assess whether they want genuine healing or prefer ongoing emotional drama. 4. Gradually offer empathic insights based on their demonstrated capacity for authentic growth. 5. Always frame empathic observations as supportive offerings rather than emotional diagnoses. Jung emphasized, "The goal is not to find people who need your empathic abilities, but to find people who appreciate your empathic abilities without becoming dependent on them." Because integrated empathic sensitivity serves both individual development and collective healing when used consciously, therefore Jung viewed successful empathic integration as essential not just for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human compassion itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual who has learned to feel deeply without losing themselves in others' emotions becomes a bridge between suffering and healing, between unconscious pain and conscious growth." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate empathic abilities become what he called compassion carriers, people who help others develop their own emotional intelligence and empathic capacity. The 4 stages of empathic transformation. Stage 1, recognition without absorption. The first transformation occurs when you learn to feel others' emotions without taking them on as your own psychological responsibility. Jung called this empathic discernment, the ability to sense what others are experiencing without becoming enmeshed in their emotional experience. Jung wrote, "The beginning of empathic wisdom is the recognition that feeling another's pain does not require taking on their suffering as your own burden to carry." Stage 2, compassion without codependency. The second stage involves learning to offer genuine support for others' growth while maintaining clear psychological boundaries. Jung called this sovereign empathy, becoming authentically compassionate while remaining emotionally independent. Jung observed, "The integrated empath offers support that empowers rather than enables, love that liberates rather than binds, and healing that promotes independence rather than dependency." Stage 3, service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your empathic abilities become a gift you offer consciously, rather than an unconscious weapon you wield for control. Jung called this conscious empathic service, using your sensitivity in support of others' authentic development without depleting your own emotional resources. Jung wrote, "The privilege of empathic sensitivity is to serve others' highest good, not their psychological dysfunction, and to offer healing that strengthens rather than weakens their capacity for independent emotional regulation." Stage 4, wisdom without superiority. The final stage involves what Jung called empathic humility, using your sensitivity to contribute to collective emotional intelligence without believing that your empathic abilities make you superior to others. Jung observed, "The truly integrated empath recognizes that sensitivity is a gift to be shared wisely, not a badge of spiritual superiority to be worn proudly." The integration becomes collective medicine. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate empathic sensitivity serve a vital evolutionary function for human emotional development. They model authentic empathy versus emotional manipulation, teach others healthy emotional boundaries, and help collective consciousness distinguish between genuine compassion and codependent enabling. Jung wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness in empathic relationships manifests as emotional manipulation, codependency, and the exploitation of sensitivity for unconscious control." Integrated empaths help make unconscious emotional manipulation conscious before it destroys relationships and communities. But Jung warned about specific pitfalls that can derail empathic integration, because the path of integrating empathic sensitivity contains specific dangers. Therefore, Jung documented the most common ways empaths derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1, the spiritual superiority trap. Jung wrote extensively about empaths who become identified with their sensitivity as evidence of spiritual advancement rather than recognizing it as raw psychological material requiring conscious integration. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he warned, "The danger is that the empath identifies with their sensitivity rather than integrating it consciously, leading to spiritual inflation that cuts them off from authentic human relationships." Highly sensitive individuals often fall into what Jung called the wounded healer complex, believing they must save everyone from emotional unconsciousness while remaining unconscious of their own emotional manipulation patterns. Jung observed, "The moment an empath believes their sensitivity makes them spiritually superior to others, they have fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by their own unintegrated shadow." Pitfall 2, the perpetual victim identification. Jung documented cases where empaths used their sensitivity to justify remaining in a permanent state of emotional victimhood. They convinced themselves that feeling others' emotions was too overwhelming to manage, which Jung recognized as unconscious manipulation disguised as helpless sensitivity. Jung wrote, "True empathic integration requires taking responsibility for one's own emotional responses, not using sensitivity as justification for emotional immaturity or manipulation of others through manufactured overwhelm." Pitfall 3. The healing addiction relapse. Jung observed that some empaths who had begun integrating their abilities would regress into unconscious healing addiction during periods of stress or loneliness. They would stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and return to creating emotional crises that required their empathic intervention. Jung warned, when empathic sensitivity becomes identity rather than ability, the person disappears behind the function. This is not integration, but its opposite: the sacrifice of individual development to unconscious empathic compulsion. Pitfall 4. The emotional intensity requirement. Even successfully integrated empaths can regress into requiring constant emotional drama and intensity to feel alive and important. They begin to find normal, healthy relationships boring and unconsciously seek out or create crisis to stimulate their empathic responses. Jung emphasized, integration is not a permanent achievement, but a dynamic process requiring constant conscious attention to one's motivations for empathic engagement. The integration maintenance. Jung developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy empathic integration. Regular solitude for distinguishing your own emotions from absorbed external emotional material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage empathic abilities rather than automatically absorbing all emotional content from your environment. Ongoing shadow work to prevent unconscious manipulation of others through manufactured emotional crises or codependent healing dynamics. Connection with other integrated empaths who can provide reality checking and support for authentic empathic development. Creative expression as an outlet for empathic input that doesn't require other people to provide emotional drama or crisis for you to process. Jung wrote, "The integrated empath does not achieve perfect empathy, but learns to dance consciously with their own emotional sensitivity without losing themselves in others' emotional experience." Because Jung understood empathic sensitivity within the context of collective emotional development, therefore he viewed integrated empaths as serving an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote, "The individual who has learned to feel deeply without becoming lost in others' emotions serves as a model for conscious empathy that the collective desperately needs." He believed that people with integrated empathic abilities serve as what he called emotional wisdom carriers. Individuals whose empathic development provides a template for healthy emotional sensitivity versus unconscious emotional manipulation. The historical pattern, Jung observed that throughout history, individuals with empathic sensitivity often appeared before collective consciousness was ready to distinguish between authentic empathy and emotional manipulation. They served as advanced models for emotional intelligence that humanity would eventually need to develop collectively. Jung wrote, "What appears in the integrated empath first as conscious emotional sensitivity later manifests in the collective as improved emotional intelligence, healthier relationship dynamics, and reduced tolerance for unconscious emotional manipulation." Modern manifestations. Jung believed that in the modern era, integrated empaths might be modeling emotional patterns that explain healthy versus unhealthy sensitivity, authentic compassion versus codependent enabling, conscious emotional support versus unconscious emotional control, and genuine healing relationships versus manipulative rescue dynamics. Jung's insight: the empathic individual feels the collective need for authentic emotional connection first and most intensely. Their personal integration often reflects what the entire culture needs to learn about healthy emotional boundaries and conscious compassion. The service without martyrdom. Jung's crucial insight was that empathic sensitivity serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously or wielded as an unconscious weapon. The goal isn't to be a martyr to others' emotions, but to be a bridge between unconscious emotional manipulation and conscious empathic wisdom. Jung wrote, "The integrated empath serves the collective not by sacrificing their emotional boundaries, but by modeling what conscious empathy looks like in practice, feeling deeply without losing oneself, offering compassion without creating dependency, and healing others by supporting their own emotional development. The ultimate integration. At the highest level of development, Jung observed that individuals with empathic sensitivity learn to hold their abilities lightly, feeling others' emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them, offering support without needing to fix or rescue, sensing emotional truth without wielding it as a weapon for control. Jung called this the transcendent empathic function, the ability to serve emotional evolution naturally without forcing, manipulating, or controlling others through empathic sensitivity, simply by embodying more conscious ways of emotional relating. Remember Jung's patient from 1919, the emotional vampire who believed herself to be a saint. After 4 years of working with Jung's shadow integration process, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish between authentic empathy and unconscious emotional manipulation. She found work supporting others' growth without creating dependency. She built relationships with people who valued her sensitivity without exploiting it for emotional caretaking. Most importantly, she stopped experiencing her empathic abilities as either a spiritual gift that made her superior or a curse that made her a victim, and began understanding them as Jung called raw psychological material requiring conscious development into wisdom. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to feel less deeply, but to feel more consciously, not to absorb less emotional content from others, but to engage more wisely with what she absorbed. Her sensitivity remained intact, but her relationship to it became integrated rather than weaponized. This represents Jung's darkest truth about empaths, that empathic sensitivity without conscious integration becomes an unconscious weapon that destroys relationships and prevents authentic emotional development. And this unconscious emotional manipulation will either destroy the empath through isolation and spiritual inflation, or transform them into exactly what humanity needs for its emotional evolution. Individuals who model conscious empathy rather than unconscious emotional control. Your empathic sensitivity isn't a spiritual gift that makes you superior to others. It's raw psychological material that requires conscious integration to become wisdom. You're not a victim of feeling too much. You're responsible for learning to feel consciously rather than unconsciously manipulating others through your emotional absorption. The question isn't whether you should suppress your empathic abilities to avoid hurting others through unconscious manipulation. The question is whether you'll develop the integration skills necessary to transform unconscious empathic weapons into conscious empathic wisdom. Jung's shadow integration method offers a path from dangerous emotional manipulation to conscious empathic service, from unconscious emotional predation to integrated empathic wisdom, from psychological weapon to evolutionary contribution. You were born to feel deeply, not to manipulate unconsciously, but to serve emotional evolution consciously. The world needs your empathic abilities, but it needs them integrated with wisdom, boundaries, and conscious compassion that transforms unconscious emotional manipulation into authentic healing. Your empathic sensitivity is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your empathic sensitivity is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed integrated empaths were meant to be. Emotional wisdom carriers, helping humanity learn the difference between authentic empathy and unconscious emotional control. Jung's darkest truth about empaths wasn't that they feel too much. It's that most empaths who feel everything never learn to use what they feel wisely, remaining unconscious emotional manipulators who believe themselves to be spiritual healers. The danger isn't in empathic sensitivity itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary emotional abilities. You are not too sensitive for this world. You are exactly what emotional evolution requires, once you learn to wield your empathic sensitivity as consciously as Jung learned to wield his psychological insights. The darkness of unconscious empathic manipulation isn't that you manipulate others, but that you might never learn to feel with the integration and wisdom your abilities demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the unconscious empathic manipulator, you're part of a sensitive group that Jung believed essential for emotional evolution. Share in the comments which type of empathic weapon you've unconsciously developed. Your integration journey connects with others walking the same path from unconscious emotional manipulation to conscious empathic wisdom. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological patterns that transcend conventional understanding of sensitivity and empathy. If you're ready to explore more of Jung's insights about emotional patterns that don't fit conventional frameworks, check out my video on Jung's most dangerous discovery about highly sensitive people, where I reveal the psychological traps that are particularly destructive for empaths and Jung's strategies for protecting your sensitivity while developing conscious emotional wisdom. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.